Hey, everybody, Melon here. Welcome back to another episode of Teardown. Today we're going to be tearing down the Logitech G Pro Superlight 2. Now, the Superlight 2 was a very interesting and confusing mouse for me. As I said in my full review, given the mouse's price and how this mouse is being marketed and its reputation, I expect this mouse to be the best mouse I've ever covered here on the channel, but in reality this mouse was very underwhelming given its very high premium price tag, and there's a lot of confusing aspects of this mouse's design, specifically the internal design. There's actually a lot of things Logitech has done on the inside of this mouse that make it very difficult to service from a user standpoint, which is definitely a big issue here, which is one of my biggest critiques about this mouse, as aside from its overall underwhelming performance and feel, the actual serviceability of this mouse from a user standpoint is very poor, as they've installed the battery in a way that you will need to remove it to service any of the mouse's top shell components, which houses pretty much the bulk of the mouse's actual components you're going to want to service, which makes doing pretty much anything to this mouse aside from basic maintenance very difficult, and the actual process of removing the battery itself is actually rather hazardous given the way they've installed it, which makes this mouse very tricky to work on. Now, because of the mouse's poor serviceability, I wanted to make a teardown guide to show you guys how to safely service this mouse, as well as talk about some things that could be improved on a future iteration of the GPX, such as the Super Strike, and talk about the individual component weights, the mouse's specs, and much more. But before we get started, as always, you will need a couple tools. Firstly, you'll need a precision set of screwdrivers. Now, all the screws inside the GPX are Phillips heads, thankfully. However, they do vary in sizes a little bit, so having a precision set with a lot of different bit sizes will be helpful, and having something like a plastic pry tool is also helpful, as it will help to open the top and base shells. Also, having something like a silicone soldering mat or just something to keep your mouse in place as you tear it down is highly advisable. Now, I like to use soldering mats because it has built-in screw and component tracking, so it makes the teardown process much easier. However, you can use pretty much whatever you want, but I would recommend having something to keep track of the screws, as the screws inside the GPX are rather particular, and you're going to want to make sure you keep track of where they go inside this shell. But once you have all those tools, you're ready to go ahead and disassemble the Logitech G Pro Superlight 2, so let's go ahead and get started. Alright, now firstly you're going to flip your mouse over and you're going to go ahead and remove the stock skates on the mouse, which is pretty easy to do as there is a skate removal ramp here and here. However, there is no removal ramp for the central puck skate or the ring skate, so be very careful when you remove these. Alright, and with the stock skates removed, you can go ahead and remove the puck from the bottom if you haven't already. We can put that off to the side. And next you're going to want to remove some screws from the base of the mouse, and they are located here, 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 and here. Now, as a quick note here, sometimes the skates will hold themselves inside the bottom shell here, which isn't an issue. They'll fall out when you take the shells apart. Now, with all the screws loosened or disconnected, you can then take a fingernail or a pry tool and jam it into the side here to separate the top and base shells, which are held together pretty thinly, and you can open the mouse up. Now, be careful in opening it because there are some cables on the inside here. As you can see, there's a large ribbon cable and a battery cable here, which we will need to disconnect the top and base shells. Now, to disconnect this ribbon cable here, this connector is a little different, as the clip is on the inside, not the outside like we commonly see. So just take a fingernail, go over to the top, and you just want to flip this up into the open position, which looks like that. And then you can just gently pull the ribbon cable out just like that. And then with the ribbon cable disconnected, we can go ahead and remove the battery's JST connector. However, due to this connector's larger size, it's actually quite firmly installed inside this clip. And if you pull too hard, you can actually pull this entire housing off the board. So take your time with this and make sure just to wiggle it free and make sure not to put too much pressure on it. And with that, that is how you disconnect the top and base shells here. We're going to go ahead and put the base shell off to the side for now, and let's first focus on the top shell. Now, the top shell of this mouse is going to be the most complicated part of this disassembly here, mainly because the battery, as I talked about earlier, as this battery is pre-installed over the access screws for the base shell here, as you need to remove the main clicks to remove some screws on the side of the shell here, very Vaxi style in terms of this, but Vaxi doesn't install the battery over the access screws like Logitech does. Now, I've already taken this mouse apart a couple times and I have already removed the battery and replaced it with a new adhesive type here. However, by default, the mouse will have a very large adhesive pad on this bottom base here, and this battery is very strongly anchored to that pad. Now, that isn't necessarily a bad thing per se, but it does make removing this battery extremely difficult, as it's so firmly installed you can actually bend or warp the battery when removing it, which is a fire hazard. So if you're going to remove this battery, you need to be very careful when removing it, and make sure to always use plastic tools like a plastic pry bar to take it apart. Never use anything metallic or sharp, as if the battery is punctured or warped, it can catch fire, as once these lithium-ion batteries are exposed to oxygen, they will ignite. So again, and be very, very careful when removing this battery. But once you've successfully and safely removed this battery, you can go ahead and put it off to the side, and now we can remove a bunch of screws from the mouse's shell here. Now the process for removing all these screws is going to be a little different than usual, as we're actually going to remove the main clicks first, not last like we normally do, and you can do so by removing a screw from here, 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 and here. Once those screws are removed, you can go ahead and loosen the main clicks by pressing up at their top region in the shell here, just to kind of loosen them up a little bit. And then you want to flip the shell over. You want to peel this ribbon cable back as gently as you can to keep it out of your way. And then you want to take a flathead screwdriver and you want to jam it into the bottom part here on the clip to disconnect it. As you can see it lifted up there. And once it's disconnected, you should be able to pull it out of the shell, just like that. We'll do the exact same process on the other click here. So in through the bottom, lift it up like that, and once it's disconnected, you should be able to pull the click out of the mouse. Just like that. Again, the clicks are installed very Vaxi-like inside the shell, just a little harder to remove than we commonly see. Now with those removed, we have access to all the other components inside the top shell here, so now we can go ahead and remove all the screws. Now there are a bunch of screws inside this mouse, as there's one here, here, there's one under the ribbon cable here, there's one here, there's another one hidden back here, there's a screw hidden in this corner here, and then flipping the shell over, there's another hidden screw there and another screw there. So you're gonna have to remove all these screws to disconnect the shells. So make sure to take your time and make sure to remove all of them. However, you're not going to remove these two screws here. Don't remove these yet. We're going to remove those in a moment. Now that you remove the screw, go ahead and double check that you didn't miss any screws in the top shell. Now I did miss one here just because it was kind of hiding in the shadow, but just double check that there's no other screws you can remove from the top shell as they're in so many different areas. So just do a quick check of the mouse, remove any screws you might have missed, and once that's done, you can go ahead and orient the shell like this and grab this back part of the central cage-like structure and pull it up and out of the shell. And then here we can see the top shell, there's actually nothing remaining inside this top shell component, as the side buttons are actually anchored to the cage-like structure in the center here, which is a very cool little feature, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now that's everything for the top shell disassembly. We'll put that off to the side, and then we can focus on this top cage-like structure here. Now firstly, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and remove the side buttons, which we can do by removing a screw from here and a screw from here. And once removed, the side buttons will come off on their own little piece. Now, as I talked in my full review, I actually really like this way of designing the side buttons. This is much better than the common side buttons we see that are anchored into the top shell, as these buttons, because they're anchored to the actual central cage-like structure of the mouse, actually feel really good in their implementation. Now, with the buttons aside, we can go ahead and look back at this top shell here. Now, as you can see, the side button PCB is peg mounted to the main board here, like it was in the Death Adder V3, the Viper V3 Pro, and the Keras Ace. And on top of it being peg mounted, as you can see, its PCB is integrated into all the other PCBs that run into this central one on the bottom here. So sadly, this side button PCB isn't really user serviceable, as if something's wrong with this PCB or you break it, you'll need to replace the PCB itself and all the ribbon cables that connect to it, which is something I'm very disappointed to see. And I've criticized Razer and Asus for having the same design as well, as while it is better for weight optimization, it is not user serviceable, and I would like to see a more serviceable side button used on a future version of the GPX. But while we can't remove the side button PCB, we can remove the main click and scroll wheel click PCB here, which is great to see. However, as you can see, Logitech has added a little failsafe here, as there is an adhesive pad over the connector here, so we'll need to remove that. Now don't throw this away and keep this on hand, as we'll reapply this to this connector when we do the reassembly. And then once that's removed, we can disconnect this cable, but this connector is the opposite style to the one used on the main board, as we have to remove the clamp on the back here into the open position. And once it's into the open position, we can gently remove this ribbon cable by just pulling it out just like that and then putting it up like this. Now once that cable is disconnected, before we remove these screws, we do need to remove one other component here, as there is this anchoring spring here on the scroll wheel. There are also springs on the stabilizers for the main clicks here and here. However, we're not going to remove them, as getting them reinstalled is a nightmare. However, this one we do have to remove, unfortunately, and you can do this by just picking it up like this and wiggling it out just like that. Now the process of putting it back in is much harder than getting it out, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And now with that removed, we can go ahead and remove a screw from here, 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 and here. to disconnect the PCB, and once all the screws are removed, we can grab by the clicks here, pull straight up to pull the entire daughter board off of the shell, just like that. And on the daughter PCB for the main clicks here, the last thing we can do is remove the scroll wheel, which we can do by grabbing the wheel and pulling outwards, just like this, to disconnect the wheel out of the encoder. And with that, that is everything for the top shell. A little bit of a complicated disassembly process, but a workable one to an extent. Now let's go ahead and disassemble the base shell. This is a little easier to do. Alright, now for the base shell here, this is going to be, as I just said, much easier than the top shell, as there's a lot less components to worry about here. However, there is a bit of a tricky aspect to this, as the power play compatibility for the mouse can be rather troublesome due to the magnets on the bottom. But before we talk about that, firstly we're going to go ahead and disconnect this little JST plug to separate the power play components from the main board. And with that removed, we can remove a screw from here, here, and here to disconnect the motherboard. And with those screws removed, we can just pull the motherboard straight out of the shell just like this, and it will come off in one solid piece. Now this slider button will probably come off with it, but if it doesn't, you can just pop that out of the base shell as well and put that off to the side. And lastly, now we can go ahead and deal with these power play components. Now this is pretty easy, however, these magnets do pose a rather annoying aspect to this, as the magnets are very strong and will magnetize themselves and all the other screws inside the mouse to them. So when you remove these magnets, make sure to keep them far away from everything else. Now to remove the power play component, we can go ahead and remove a screw from here, 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 and here. Now with the screw sorter, we'll put this off to the side for now, and just to give you an idea of how strong these magnets are, I'm going to put one here and the other side here. And they literally magnetize themselves through all this silicon. So again, these are very, very strong, so make sure to keep them far away from everything else, especially these components, because if you mix them with this is going to be a nightmare. Alright, and with everything removed from the base shell, we'll put that off to the side. And now I'm going to go ahead and grab our main board, our battery, the daughter PCB here, and the side button PCB and the cage structure, and talk about the mouse's PCB layout and its specs. Starting off, let's talk about the main board, which is a little differently designed than most main boards we've covered here on the channel, as it is actually a dual-sided motherboard, with the sensor being centrally structured here and all the connectors being located here, and on the opposite side we have the base of the sensor and the unit's port and also its MCU on the base, which is kind of unique, we haven't seen before. Now for sensor, as expected for a Logitech mouse, this is using the Hero 2, this is the revision 004 version, which is definitely a very interesting sensor compared to Pixar's offerings. I do personally think Pixar offerings are superior as they support more features, but I know some people prefer the feel of Logitech sensors. And then flipping it over on the base here, we have the MCU, which is a Nordic 52833 SKU, which is a slightly lower memory version compared to the 52840, but despite the lower memory, the implementation is good here on the GPX2. For the battery, the mouse is using a 290 mAh battery, which is a bit of an odd capacity. I know Razer uses 306 mAh batteries, and Logitech seems to be using their own odd size, but regardless, for its capacity, it's a very well-sized battery, and it is using the larger 3-pin 2mm JST connector, which, as I talked about in my full review and I'll mention again here, Logitech has hot glued the cables into the top of the connector in an effort to prevent them from coming loose, which is a cool thing to see. However, if you're going to mod the mouse's battery and you want to reuse this connector, this glue does make this a little tricky, as you have to melt that off to rewire the connector, but that's a pretty minimal issue here. For the mouse's side buttons, the mouse is using a rather familiar switch here, as these are the Omron D2LS21 switches, the same micro switches used by G-Wolves, Pulsar, and a couple other brands for their mice. Now these are a heavier switch, but again, the side buttons, due to their unique positioning on the side shell here, are actually quite well tensioned, so I don't mind the heavier switch feel here on the GPX2, and it's cool to see such a familiar switch here on a Logitech product. And for the main click PCB here, despite Logitech's advertisements as the mouse is using their supposed light force switches, they're actually using a custom Omron switch, which are a special SKU, as you can see on the side here, as these are the D2FP-FH2 Logi SKU, which I assume are a variant of the D2FP-F2N SKU, the typical Omron optical switch we see used in many mice nowadays. For scroll wheel encoder, Logitech is using a TTC silver 8mm encoder here, which is definitely a bit of an odd choice. I much would have rather seen an optical encoder used here, as these mechanical ones are quite prone to issues, and Logitech has their own software patch to fix the issues with these encoders specifically. And for the scroll wheel click, the mouse is using an unknown pillar switch design. I assume this is a TTC or a Kale switch, I'm not 100% sure, but despite its unknown nature, just like all the other mice in the market that use these pillar switches for their scroll wheel click switch, it is the same spongy feel to it, which is definitely a little underwhelming. I would have liked to see a full-size switch, or maybe a switch with a little more force to it, but regardless, that's the implementation here on the GPX2. Alright, now that we talked about the mouse's PCB layouts and specs, let's go ahead and talk about the mouse's individual component weights next. In terms of component weights, as I talked about in my full review, Logitech is advertising that the GPX2 will weigh 60 grams on the dot, but as it turns out, the mouse actually weighs less than advertised in its stock configuration, only weighing the advertised 60 grams if the optional skate puck is installed, which is very impressive, and Logitech is the only brand I've covered to date where their mouse actually weighs less than advertised, which is a great thing to see, and hopefully Logitech continues this going forward. Sure, there are some ways Logitech could have weight optimized the GPX2 a little more, but regardless, its weight is quite good in my opinion. Now, starting off with the component weights, the top shell with everything removed from it weighs around 12.68 grams. The base shell with everything removed from it weighs around 7.86 grams. The mouse's central cage-like structure with the side button PCB and all of its ribbon cables still installed on it weighs around 7.94 grams. The mouse's main clicks collectively weigh 6.38 grams. The side buttons with their unique anchoring mechanism weigh 1.24 grams. The mouse's scroll wheel weighs 1.9 grams. The slider button for the mouse's base shell weighs 0.36 grams. The mouse's battery weighs around 5.42 grams. The mouse's main PCB weighs 5.82 grams. The daughter PCB for the main click, scroll wheel, and scroll wheel click weighs 3.56 grams. The mouse's power play components with the magnets weighs around 1.26 grams, which can easily be removed, so if you want to weight mod the GPX and shave off about a gram or so, you can remove the central power play components. And lastly, all of the mouse's screws and the spring that holds the scroll wheel in place collectively weigh 1.65 grams. Alright, now that we talked about PCB layout specs and individual component weights, let's go ahead and start our reassembly process. And we're going to start off by reassembling the top shell, and we're going to start with the central cage-like structure. Now the first step here is going to be taking the daughter PCB for the main click, scroll wheel, and scroll wheel click, and we're going to go ahead and connect this to the central ribbon connector first. Now we can do this by flipping up this back side of the connector, like that, into the open position as you can see here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to very gently feed the cable into this connector, like that, and once it's in place, we're going to clip down the other side to hold it in. And then once that's done, we're going to kind of orient it like this. And then once that's done, you're going to take that adhesive pad we saved earlier, and you're just going to go ahead and put it over the connector, just like that. Now that that's done, we can go ahead and grab our scroll wheel, and we're going to take the thinner end of this wheel, and we're going to put it into that little hole in the encoder, as you can see right there. And just be gentle while doing this, make sure not to tug on this ribbon cable too much, but just take this, line it up, and press it into place just like that. And then once that's done, we can go ahead and anchor the PCB onto the shell by dropping it down into place, and you can use these little pegs for the scroll wheel as an alignment helper there, and you just drop it into place just like that, and with a little bit of, you might have to fidget it around a little bit, but it should click in just like that. And then with the board positioned properly, you're going to go ahead and take your anchoring screws and re-anchor a screw here, 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 and here. And now that the board is installed, now we have to go ahead and reinstall this tiny little anchoring spring we took out earlier. Now, to be completely honest, this is going to be really hard to show, so I apologize in advance. But basically what we have to do is you have to angle it in a way where you can get the central part of this spring over its little stabilizer right here, while also bending it enough where it clips over. Now, again, I'm going to try and show you guys how to do this, but again, it's very, very finicky. I would recommend taking tweezers to do this, by the way. So kind of put it in at an angle, line it up and over, and oh my god, we got it on the first try. It's a miracle. Now, once you get this installed, it's very important to make sure that it is oriented properly. As you can see here, it is completely straight. Now, it's very important to make sure you put this into its little stabilizer here, as if you don't, this will actually naturally come off and the spring will fall out. So make sure to orient this spring properly and put it into its little threader just like that. Now that we have the main PCB reinstalled and everything is aligned properly, we can flip the shell over, and now let's go ahead and re-anchor these side buttons. Now, the side buttons anchor to the top shell with this little hook-like structure here, and what you can do is you can just orient the shell like this and drop the clicks on top just like this, and then once it's installed, just verify the plastic on the threaders here is kind of roughly even with the surface of the buttons there, and then you can take your screws and re-anchor these side buttons themselves to the central cage-like structure. Alright, and then once those are installed, just go ahead and double check your side buttons, make sure they work, which they do in our case, so we are good to go. Now that everything is done in the central cage-like structure, we can go ahead and mount it into the top shell here. However, just like other mice that have used this cage-like structure, you have to put this cage into the top shell a little different, and this is very true here as the side buttons are pre-installed on the shell. Now, you can install this without the side buttons in place and just put it in like that. However, doing so is very difficult, and actually sliding the side buttons in between the central cage-like structure and the side shell is really hard to do, hence why I recommend installing them beforehand, because doing it the other way is pretty pretty bad. Now, unlike most other mice where you put the cage-like structure in from the top and then slide it in at an angle kind of like this, you actually want to slide it in like this. So you want to curve it into the shell kind of like this with a little bit of a weird angle. And what you want to do is you want to line up the side buttons with the shell. That's kind of the primary point here. So kind of get it into place like this. And then once it's roughly in place and everything looks like it's in properly, just click and press down and you should hear a click. Now mine clicked already, but you hear kind of a click when it goes into place just like that. And then once that's done, you can go ahead and start anchoring a couple screws around the mouse's sides. And then once the cage is installed into the top shell, flip this ribbon cable back like this and re-anchor the central screw into the top here. And then once this central screw is installed here, you can go ahead and install the myriad of other screws that anchor the cage to the top shell here. So just as a reminder, there's one here, there's one here, hiding in the corner here, and there's also one back here. And then flipping the shell over, there's one at the top here and another one hiding up at the top there. Alright, now with those screws reinstalled, our next step is going to be reinstalling the main clicks, which is a pretty straightforward process, which is nice to see. Again, relatively similar to what we find on a Vaxi mouse. Now, as per usual, the process for this is going to be putting the click in through the top. You want to thread it through this kind of gap here, and then it's going to go and stand on its little standoffs here. However, because there are so many stabilizing components on these main clicks, specifically this top one, this can be a little harder than usual. So just take your time with this and make sure not to put too much pressure on it and make sure you do it properly. Now, to start off, we're going to put the click in through the bottom, just like this, and then once we get it into the shell, we're going to line up the stabilizers as best we can on the top shell. And then once we get it roughly into position, and then we're gonna reach into the shell, press down on the click ends here to anchor them into the shell, and then you just wanna verify they're sitting flat, just like that. And a good trick to tell if they're installed properly is that the buttons should be flush with the top shell, just like that. If they're slightly lower, don't worry about that because we haven't anchored the screws yet, but there shouldn't be like a gigantic gap like that. And then we'll do the same process for the next click. So we're gonna go in through the top here, lining it up as best we can, align the stabilizers from the top shell as much as we can, which can be a little finicky sometimes, specifically on this click for some reason. I'm not really sure why. And once it's in place, press down, and then verify the top shell that it's sitting flat. Now, once the clicks are installed, the next step is going to be reinstalling their anchoring screws. However, you need to be very careful here on the GPX, more so than other mice, as the threading for the pilot holes, as you can see, is incredibly thin, and I have actually managed to snap 2 of my pilot holes with minimal pressure. I don't know why the plastic is so fragile, specifically on this side of the shell, but be very, very careful with this, as normally over-tensioning these screws will mess with the actuation weight of the main clicks, but actually over-tensioning these can actually break the main clicks. So be extremely careful when re-anchoring these screws and do not over-tension them under any circumstances. This is actually going to be the only time I'd actually recommend leaving them under-tensioned, as again, it's so easy to break this plastic, at least from my experience. But with that little warning out of the way, let's go ahead and re-anchor our main clicks. All right, and then once those are reinstalled, go ahead and flip the mouse over and you want to take a look at the main clicks here. Now, normally we have to check the buoyancy of the main clicks. However, since the clicks are installed into the top shell, we don't have to do that here. All you need to do is make sure the clicks are sitting at roughly the same height, which mine aren't because I broke the pilot holes on mine, so mine's a little off. But yours should sit like this, and just make sure your clicks actually work. And make sure they have the expected rebound to them. And while you're at it, go ahead and test your scroll wheel and test your side buttons to make sure everything is still functional. Again, the side buttons and the scroll wheel are going to work pretty much no matter what. It's the main clicks that are the biggest issue, just because the pilot holes in the mouse's shell are so fragile. All right, and then with the main clicks installed, the last thing we can do here is re-anchor the battery. Now, as I talked about earlier, in order to access any of the top shell components, you will need to remove the battery, and I would recommend entirely removing all the adhesive pads. So just get rid of the whole adhesive pad here, so whatever new adhesive you put on the bottom of your battery will anchor properly. Now, I just used some double-sided adhesive from mine, but you can use whatever you want, but I would recommend using a stronger adhesive, just to make sure the battery doesn't come loose inside the shell. Now, to reposition the battery, you want to orient the battery towards the base here, but you want to put it into the bottom corner as much as you can, and it should sit roughly in the shell just like that. Now, if you are going to mod in a new battery, again, there is ample space to do so. However, keep in mind that the battery's positioning will, of course, affect the mouse's balancing. So if you're going to mod in a smaller or a larger battery, keep that in mind, but there is ample enough install area to put pretty much whatever you want here. Just make sure it has the proper size JST connector connector, and you can always reuse the one from this mouse if you want to, but you will have to undo the hot glue on the connector here to reuse it, as I mentioned earlier. But regardless, that is everything for the top shell. We'll go ahead and put that off to the side for now, and now let's go ahead and reassemble the base shell. Alright, now for the base shell, the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and reinstall the bottom control button, which is relatively easy to do, as you want to orient it in this position like this into the bottom shell. You just want to drop it into place, just like that. And you want to orient it where if you pull it up, it goes to blue and down to red. If you've done it the other way, it is installed improperly and the shells will not go together, so keep that in mind. Now you want to put this into the lowermost position just like this, as when you go to reinstall the main board, on the bottom of it there is a small control switch right here, and in the up position it turns the board on, and in the bottom position turns the board off. Now if this is in the up position and this switch is in the off position, there is the potential to break this switch, rendering your mouse inoperable, so make sure to put this into the bottommost position and make sure this slider is also in the bottommost position. Now once that's done, go ahead, take the PCB, flip it over, and with the USB-C port oriented towards the front of the mouse, you just want to drop it into place. Now the easiest way to align this is to use these little peg holes as guides, as they correspond to the standoffs here, here, and here. So just take the board and drop it into place, and you might have to move it around a little bit, but you should get it into place just like that. It should clip in, and once it's in place, just verify the plastic standoffs are sitting roughly even with the PCB surface, just like that. And then you can go ahead and take your anchoring screws and re-anchor the PCB. Alright, and then once the main board is installed, flip the mouse over and just verify this control switch is functional, which it is in our part. As long as you oriented it properly, it should work in 99% of the time, but if it doesn't work, just reseat the board to make sure it made proper connection. And then now with the main board reinstalled, we can go ahead and reconnect the power play components. Now this power play system is oriented where the red cable goes towards the right side of the mouse and this black cable goes towards the left side, so make sure you orient that properly. Now the first step to reconnecting this is going to be reconnecting this JST connector, which is very straightforward. As we just put it into place, take our fingernails in the corner and press it down just like that. And then once this is installed, we can go ahead and reinstall the magnets. However, keep in mind the magnets are oriented a little differently, and this stubbier part is going to go into the bottom of the shell here, but orienting it is a little tricky, and you can't use tools because it will stick to the tools, and it has a habit of falling through the bottom of the mouse, which is quite annoying, but with a little bit of fidgeting, you should be able to get it into place. And then what you want to do is you want to put the anchoring screw on the tip of your screwdriver, take your finger and line up this little part as best as you can, and then you have to take your finger and use it as a guide to kind of hold the screw in place as you screw it in, just like that. Now the reason you do this is because if you don't have your finger there, the magnet will pull the screw away from the screwdriver, which makes this very annoying to do and really hard to show as well, so I apologize for that aspect to this. But basically you just want to use your fingers as guides to kind of hold the screw in place as you do this. And with that, you should be able to get it into place just like that. Now, once it's anchored in, flip the mouse over and make sure this is sitting flat. You would not believe how many times I've put this thing together and this actually is misaligned, but you can't tell from the top. So make sure it's sitting completely flat, and if it's misaligned, just go ahead and re-anchor it from the top. Now, we're going to go ahead and put in the second magnet here, which is also difficult, as unfortunately, the pull from the magnet on the other side actually pulls this magnet out of place all the time, which makes this even more annoying than it has to be. Also, as a note, I forgot to mention this earlier, make sure you orient this with the bendy part down, so you want the convex part of this little piece of metal to be facing the magnet and the concave part to be facing the top. So put it into place like that. Use your finger as a guide to anchor it into place, and then we'll flip this over and do the exact same thing on the other side. Just like that. And then once those magnets are installed, just go ahead and verify that this still works, which it does. And if you actually have a PowerPlay compatible mat, you can go ahead and put the PowerPlay puck into the mouse and verify this still works. But as long as this is wired properly, this should be fully functional. And now we can grab our top shell and reassemble the mouse. Alright, now to reassemble the top and base shells, this process is going to be pretty straightforward. However, it's going to be a little hard for me to show you how to do this just because this ribbon cable is very awkwardly positioned. Starting off, we're going to go ahead and take our shells and orient them into kind of a clam-like position like this. And then we're going to take the mouse's JST plug and we're going to anchor it into its connector, which is a little tricky to do in some cases, but it should go into place just like that. And once it's in, you just clamp down the sides just like the other JST connector to put it into place. Now this ribbon cable, on the other hand, is the trickier part of this entire entire conundrum here, as due to its curvature and where it's positioned, it's very difficult to reposition. Now, to open this connector, you have to clip open this top part, like as I showed earlier, into the open position like that. And then you have to kind of feed this cable into it, which I will do my best to show you guys the process for that. Now, these cables are a little harder to remount than traditional ribbon cables because it's a little thinner. So it will probably take you a couple times to do this. But if you're lucky, you should be able to get it in without too much trouble, just like that. And once it's seated into place, make sure it's in all the way, and then clip the top of the connector down just like that. Now, once you've done that, before you do anything else, go ahead and put the shells together just roughly like this. So you just kind of put them together, flip the mouse on, and verify the mouse still works. So make sure that the LED turns on, test all the functions on the mouse, test the sensor, test the power button on the bottom, test all the buttons, make sure everything works before you put the mouse back together. Now, in the rare case there is something functionally wrong with the mouse, 99% of the time it's because it's a piece of dust or just this cable isn't seated properly. So reseat the cable and that should fix your issue. If something else in the mouse isn't working, it's likely something wrong with the top shell components. Like for example, if your main clicks, your scroll wheel isn't working, maybe the ribbon cable we re-anchored earlier has the same issue as this one here. So if your main clicks or scroll wheel or something on the top shell isn't working, take the mouse apart again, verify that ribbon cable towards the top is anchored properly. But if you followed my instructions properly, everything should work completely fine. And once you've verified everything is functional on the mouse, you can go ahead and turn the mouse off, and now we can re-anchor all the screws for the mouse's base. And then with those screws installed, just run your thumb along the side of the mouse to make sure there isn't any creaky areas in the side. Generally speaking, the top and base shells meld together quite well, so you don't really have to worry about this. But just because I took the whole thing apart, just make sure the top and base shells are making proper contact. And once that's done, you can go ahead and reinstall your preferred set of skates on the bottom, reinstall your preferred puck, and you've successfully disassembled and reassembled the Logitech G Pro Superlight 2. Overall, while this mouse is very complex, again, it isn't exactly a mouse I'd recommend servicing due to Logitech positioning the battery over the top shell access screws, which is a big thing I really don't like to see. We've seen other brands like Asus, Vaxi, and Razer utilize these cage-like structures to much better effect in my opinion, as while they're functionally the same, those mice are much more serviceable than the GPX here, and the entire concept of having to remove a battery that is very difficult to remove and could be a fire hazard to access any of the mouse's internals is a really big issue, and given the issues with the mouse's scroll wheel, you will likely need to open this mouse at some point during the mouse's lifespan. There is of course a laundry list of other things I would like to see improved on this mouse, as there's a lot of areas of this mouse that are a little underwhelming considering the mouse's price, but regardless of all that, the mouse is serviceable to an extent. However, Logitech has definitely done some things to make this mouse much less serviceable than other brands' mice, and in my opinion, because of this and the overall lackluster performance of this mouse, this is not a mouse I'd really recommend getting per se in its current state. But regardless, that is how you fully disassemble and reassemble the Logitech G Pro Superlight 2. Thank you very much for watching, I greatly appreciate it. If you found this video helpful and want to see more videos like this, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And if you want to see reviews and teardowns of Logitech's other products like the upcoming Super Strike or maybe the 2C in the Logitech decks, leave a comment down below and let me know what you want to see me cover next. And if you'd like to support my efforts here on the channel with the Teardown Project, my in-depth reviews and my guide videos, consider becoming a member here on the channel, as that is the best way to directly support my efforts here on the channel, and channel members get early access to all upcoming content here on the channel, including videos like this one. But that's everything for today's episode of Teardown. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of Teardown. Peace.